So here we are at the program of today, which is very special for several reasons. First of all, it is not on the first Sunday of the month, but it is on the last Sunday. We don't have snow. And Ian Thomson was so gracious to come in spring. He was supposed to come on, I think, December 7th. And he went to Heathrow Airport, didn't go to his daughter's birthday, and as soon as he got to Heathrow, he found out that Newark Airport was closed. So we are especially grateful to you. Ian Thomson wrote this, the first book on the first biography the first biography that he wrote was published in England in 2002, I think in the summer of 2002. And then the new book, the American version, came out in December when you were supposed to come here. And it is the most comprehensive biography you can read about somebody. It was such a pleasure for me to read this book because I was a little bit concerned. Primo Levi is a special person, such a modest writer, such a modest person, so such an equilibrium. And I was a little bit afraid to read a biography on Primo Levi. Well, I don't know how to thank you personally for being such a sensitive person. You need somebody with a lot of sensitivity to write about Primo Levi. And I hope that you will appreciate Ian Thomson today and his book, that actually we have some copies here if you want to purchase them, and you have to talk to Linda about it. Ian, thank you for coming from London last night for us. So, I'm sorry, I forgot to say the most important things. Ian is a writer, a journalist, a critic. He is also a translator of Italian books. Yes.
That's more than enough. Thank you, Alessandra. Good evening, and thank you all very much for coming along to this talk this afternoon. As Alessandra says, the last time I was supposed to be here, it had turned out there was a freak snowfall over this whole part of America. I got to the airport, as Alessandra says, Heathrow, to be turned away by somebody at the Virgin Airlines checkout, who told me that there were no flights at all to the New Jersey area. So I had to go home, crestfallen, feeling really depressed. And my daughter's birthday party was then over, so I had all this enormous amount of washing up to do. So I'm very glad to have escaped at least 4 days of washing up this time around, because I'm here until Thursday morning. One of the reasons that I've made this long journey from England across the Atlantic to Dorothea's house is that Alessandra has promised me a delicious Italian meal after the talk, which is appropriate, I think, because Primo Levi, himself a native of Piedmont, was very attached to the pleasures of eating and drinking. This may surprise some of you who could have an image of Primo Levi as being the rather austere documenter of this unique instance of human infamy, which was Auschwitz. But nevertheless, he had this passion for simple food. And he would go on incredibly long, immense detours in search of modest tavernas and restaurants that served the regional specialities of, for example, tripe and beans. And when Levi found what he was looking for, he was, in the words of a friend, the happiest of gourmands. In fact, although I don't want to go on too long about food here, the simplicity of Levi's gastronomic tastes surprised a good many people. In Turin, where he was born, of course, he often brought visitors to a restaurant, which some of you may know, in the heart of the old city called Le Tre Galline, where he ordered tangy goat's cheese and chickpea pancakes. I believe this is a Piedmontese speciality. But there were, however, some comic misunderstandings over food. One time, seated at a restaurant in Turin with an English business colleague called Keith Barnes, who spoke no Italian, Levi solemnly informed his guest that he was eating mice. Mice cooked in milk, he said. Seeing Mr. Barnes's shocked disbelief, Levi wrote the word down for him on a napkin. It was in fact maize, which I think may be pronounced mice by some Italians. So, as well as maize or mice, polenta, Levi had a typically Piedmontese passion also for frogs. And it wasn't just the legs that Primo Levi liked, he also chomped on the heads as well. I was told this by Mr. Keith Barnes, who's still shocked by this after all these years. Anyway, enough of food. I'd like to thank both Alessandra and also Professor Pietro Frassica of the Department of French and Italian at Princeton University, who sadly can't be with us today, for inviting me here to talk about Primo Levi. From Alessandra, I understand that Dorothea's house was built 100 years ago, also for the Italians who came to Princeton to work as stone cutters. I think Primo Levi would have appreciated this fact. He always said he admired manual skills, the ability to think with one's hands, as he called it, and the dignity of an ancient trade like stone cutting, I think, would have appealed to Primo Levi. Indeed, it was part of his very Piedmontese character. So this evening I would like to talk about Primo Levi's roots in his native Piedmont and his, I suspect, very Piedmontese appreciation of, among other things, the virtue of hard work, il lavoro ben fatto. I'd like to concentrate above all on Primo Levi's relationship to the Piedmontese capital of Turin, a relationship which I would say was almost one of absolute love. I'll also touch on the Piedmontese countryside, which Primo Levi's ancestors had known so well, and which was the scene of a family scandal regarding Primo Levi's grandfather. I'll be talking a little bit about this, but also about Primo Levi's father, Cesare Levi, who I think was in many ways an absolutely classically Piedmontese character. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Piedmontese man who saved Primo Levi's life at Auschwitz, the bricklayer Lorenzo Perrone, whom some of you may remember from Primo Levi's masterpiece, Se questo è un uomo, if this is a man, his account of Auschwitz. So I'll be talking about all of these, but before I do that, I'd like just to to tell you a little bit about my own encounter with Primo Levi. I met Primo Levi at his home in Turin one summer afternoon in July 1986. He was, I remember, in his shirt sleeves for the interview, and the tattoo 74517 was visible to me, clearly visible on his left forearm. Levi said to me with a certain amount of cynicism that it was a typical German talent for classification. In February 1944, Primo Levi was deported, as I'm sure you all know, to the Nazi concentration camp of Auschwitz, with 650 other Jews, not all of them Italian. When I met Levi that summer of 1986 in Turin, he was almost 68 years old, but he still had, I remember, a sprightliness about him. I had seen him earlier that year, in fact, at the Italian Cultural Institute in London, where he gave a talk. I'd already published in the British literary periodical several interviews with Italian writers, among them Italo Calvino, Natalia Ginzburg, and Leonardo Sciascia, and Alberto Moravia. And Levi was to be part of a set. Throughout our conversation, I remember he sat on a worn chintz armchair, smoking the occasional menthol cigarette. I think the brand was Alaska, if anybody knows that. They gave an absolutely horrible smell. His beard was very neatly clipped, and he wore metal-rimmed glasses. The study, which was sparsely furnished, contained an angle poise lamp, a word processor, and some other basic necessities for writing. Books lined the walls, a few of them in English, I noticed. There were framed certificates from Levi's former profession as a chemist, and suspended above a glass-fronted bookcase, an owl, a penguin, and a giant butterfly, modelled by Levi out of industrial copper wire. For nearly 30 years, Levi had managed a paint and varnish factory on the outskirts of Turin. The only other ornament in the room that I could see was a sketch of a half-destroyed wire fence, Auschwitz. In Italy, as I'm sure you know, Levi really is a national monument. At the time of meeting him, I was 24 years old and very nervous of meeting this national monument. The Turinese, moreover, are considered by other Italians, and forgive me if there are some people in the audience tonight with Turinese ancestors, I apologise. They're considered to be two-faced and frosty, or falso e cortese, they say, false and courteous. Yet the lady I met, I must say, was very warm and engaging, a mixture of seriousness and sweetness. The afternoon was full of unexpected laughter as well, and there were moments when Levi became quite animated. For instance, when the talk came round to mountaineering, a favourite and I dare say classically Piedmontese pastime of his. I decided to leave the question of Auschwitz until later, unsure how to approach it, as I then was. Absurdly, I was fearful that it might distress Levi. Instead, I asked him about his science fiction short stories and about chemistry, his profession. Listening to the tapes of these conversations today, I must say that I'm struck by, A, how banal my questions are, and also how stock Levi's answers seem. By the time that I met him, he was a very practiced interviewee and could field professionally virtually any question about the Nazi period. The second half of our conversation centred on If This Is a Man, Se Questo È un Uomo, unsatisfactorily entitled, I think, in the American translation as Survival in Auschwitz. And this is now a set text in all Italian schools. I think no other work that I've read anyway conveys the unique horror of the Nazi genocide so directly or profoundly, or interrogates our recent moral history so incisively. For its very quiet testimony of man's inhumanity to man, I would say that it remains one of the essential books of our age. 9 months after our meeting, Primo Levi was dead. Primo Levi was profoundly attached to Piedmont and very, very proud of his Turin roots. He spent most of his life actually in the Piedmontese capital of Turin, living and dying in the house where he was born. In some ways, I would say that Levi's life, with the obvious and appalling exception of Auschwitz, was not in fact that adventurous at all. And I think it should be said from the outset that in many ways, at least for me, Turin is a most un-Italian city, providing a gateway to the Italian peninsula nevertheless. After Italy's unification in 1861, when Turin was briefly the nation's capital, the Turinese would ask if the post had arrived from Italy yet. Because of the city's proximity to France, Levi's parents, like many bourgeois Piedmontese, would dot their conversation with French or almost French words like mon fils for Mr. or bonne nuit for good night. Turin, where Levi was born in 1919, is also a famously symmetrical city of straight avenues and grandly arcaded piazzas. French architects had laid down the city's grid plan in the 16th century, and their mathematical design created apparently about 10,000 meters of interlinked sheltering colonnades, which I think are very useful when it rains, because you can walk for great distances in Turin without getting wet, if you don't have an umbrella, I mean. Turin, according to Primo Levi, was, he said, logical, spacious, and self-controlled. He believed that the city's orderly grid plan layout in some ways mirrored the restrained character, as he saw it, of the Turinese people. In their dialect, in fact, the Turinese like to say, "Esageremo ne," let's not exaggerate. I would say Levi upheld this virtue of concision in his writing, just as much as he did in his life. By the time Levi was born in Turin, as I said, in 1919, the northern Italian city had acquired quite a sort of stolid bourgeois air. And this was reflected in the clockwork eating habits of the inhabitants of Turin, with supper taken at precisely 8 o'clock, followed by a routine digestive. Recreations and the cultural life of the city were increasingly mindful of middle-class propriety, and the high middle-class tradition is still maintained in today's Turin in Piazza San Carlo. Known as the Parlour of Turin, this grand, airy square has many elegant cafes with marble-topped tables. Here, the city's old guard, you can still see them sipping coffees over their slices of gianduiotti, I think that's how you pronounce it, hazelnut-studded chocolate cakes. Even today, I think Turin is an innately conservative city of protocols, etiquette, and due proportions. There are very few modern structures there. In fact, there's a 6-story building is ambitiously referred to by the locals as a grattacielo, a skyscraper. I know the Flatiron is supposed to be a skyscraper, but that's probably more than 6 stories. And as with all cities built to a grid plan, it'd be quite difficult, I find it quite difficult to know where you are in Turin. From this very disorientating design comes, I think, a sort of vague melancholy. In the evenings, when the sun casts its shadows across the angular squares of the city, Turin can appear quite unreal. The proto-surrealist painter Giorgio de Chirico was moved by this ghostliness, and his lunar landscapes with their broken statues and endless colonnades, some of you might have seen these paintings, are really, I think, portraits of Primo Levi's Turin. Turin is also renowned to be a supernatural centre, and this, I think, hints at a much darker undertone. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche reputedly went mad in Turin. He was seen to embrace a cart horse off Via Po, I think sometime in the late 1880s. And white magicians and occultists like to claim that Turin forms part of a magic triangle with Lyon and Prague. The mountains that encircle Turin provide an escape, I think, from the city's slightly spooky confinement. In the summer, the alpine backdrop looks quite cool and inviting, and the city's one extravagant landmark, the Molle Antonelliana, or Antonelli's Pile, I think it's translated as, seems to rise above these peaks. With its knitting needle spire, this building, the Molle, was commissioned in 1863 as a synagogue, but for lack of funds it was never finished. The Molle, which still gets, I think, a capital M in Turin, is now a museum, and also a failed monument in a way to the aspirations of emancipated Piedmontese Jewry, of which Primo Levi was very much a part. Primo Levi was delivered at home in the Piedmontese capital on the 31st of July 1919, the year that the First World War formally ended. He was one of 12 babies born in Turin that summer's day. I know this because I checked in my madness the archives of La Stampa. 9 males, it said 3 females. His Piedmontese parents named him Primo, which is not a very common name in Italy, after primogenito, the firstborn. In keeping with Jewish custom, the baby Primo was circumcised on the 8th day of his life, and a drop of wine placed on his lips in blessing. They gave him the middle name of Michele, after his paternal grandfather. So it was Primo Michele Levi. As time went on, though, Levi's mother Esther preferred to call her boy Mino, from the affectionate diminutive Primino, little Primo. A studio portrait taken in Turin in 1920, which is reproduced in my book there, shows Esther cradling her beloved Mino at about 8 months. According to one family legend, the baby Primo Levi was a Botticellian angel. In the photograph I've mentioned, he wears a teething necklace of amber beads and a lace pinafore. I didn't know that amber was used in those days for teething. Esther's devotion to her son Primo, though, was inevitably complicated by all sorts of anxieties. He was a sickly baby who suffered from croup and whooping cough, and he was routinely soothed by his mother with Piedmontese lullabies. I think from the very first, Primo Levi, as a firstborn Jewish son, Primino, bore a very heavy burden of parental hopes and expectations. When Primo was born, his parents were living in Turin at 75 Corso Re Umberto. Esther's parents, Primo Levi's mother, Esther's parents, had given the newlyweds the flat as part of their marriage dowry. The property, in a fashionable neighbourhood of the Piedmontese capital, had been in Primo Levi's mother's family since 1909. It was a 5-storey apartment block built to the west of the city in the first flush of Belle Epoque prosperity, and it still stands to this day. The Levi couple's new home was huge but rather dark, with not much sunlight. As I remember from my interview with Levi that very distant summer of 1986, the high frescoed ceilings were slightly domed, and the parquet floors were very vigorously beeswaxed. 2 north-facing balconies overlooked the elegant Via Vico, with a rear balcony above a courtyard, a giddy 3 flights below. Genteel Piedmontese standards and conditions prevailed in the Levi household, and Primo was raised on a mixture of coddling and bourgeois stiffness. In the main entrance hall, the concierge put up a polite notice, which is still on display today: begging is not allowed. After the First World War, this part of Turin, La Crocetta, had lost its leafy exclusivity when it attracted the nouveau riche grown wealthy on munitions. Known as pesce cane, sharks, they flaunted their war wealth by building solidly outsized new tenements with these great fairy book turrets. Many of them affected the heirs of the Savoy nobility and even named their children after the Savoy royalty. Primo Levi's new home was in a district of Turin called, as I said earlier, the Crocetta, or Little Cross, after a church nearby. Some of you may be familiar with this district. With its wide, airy avenues, the Crocetta is effectively a city within Turin. Its inhabitants are known as Crocettari. Middle-class Jews were especially keen to settle here. The Jewish population of Turin had in fact almost doubled in size since the emancipation in 1848. And by 1919, when Primo Michele Levi was born, the figure stood at about 2,500. With the city's crumbling ghetto a good half hour's walk away, the Crocetta had become, in some ways, a desirable new suburb for enfranchised Jewry. And Primo Levi's parents became dedicated and enthusiastic Crocettari, as Primo Levi did himself later on. Like most Piedmontese Jews, the Levis claimed descent from the Sephardim, after Sepharad Hebrew for Spain, who had fled anti-Semitic Castile in the 15th century. They settled in Piedmont in about 1500. The earliest records that I could find, linked the Levis to the Piedmontese town of Mondovì. Giuseppe Levi, the great-grandfather of the writer, was born in the town ghetto of Mondovì in about 1819. He was a moneylender, and the Levi Bank had been established in Mondovì a year after his birth in about 1819. And here, at this point in my talk, we come to a mystery at the heart of Levi's relationship with his Piedmontese roots. In his books, Primo Levi wrote almost nothing of his immediate family. Nowhere does one learn of the circumstances of his marriage, his wife's name, or even if he had children. Why is this? Levi came from a Piedmontese family that guarded its secrets very, very closely. A scandal, as I said earlier, in the previous generation had been suppressed. The scandal had undermined the Levi family's high position in Piedmontese society. And I'd like now to talk a little bit about this scandal, if that's not too strong a word. One episode in the long research which I undertook for my biographies of Primo Levi stands out. I remember I was scrolling through a collection of old newspapers on microfilm in the Turin Civic Library when I chanced on an item that described the violent death of Levi's paternal grandfather. This was a revelation to me. Engineer Michele Levi had been rushed to Turin's General Hospital, San Giovanni Battista, in the summer of 1888. I went to take a look at this hospital, and in its vastness and its melancholy, it resembles a sort of military garrison, and it's about as welcoming as a military garrison. It was a surprise for me to find that the admission registers for 1888 still existed. They were conserved in a chilly, kind of dank wing of the building and freckled brown with age. what they told me was that Michele Levi, Primo Levi's paternal grandfather, had committed suicide. Michele Levi was born not far from Mondovì, in the much smaller Piedmontese town of Benevagenna in 1849. A main branch of the Levi bank was situated in a large house off the town's main square, the main square of Benevagenna, called Piazza Botero. A contemporary engraving shows stables for horse and carriages opposite the cash tills and balconies trailing rather kind of romantic-looking blue wisteria. Giuseppe Levi, Michele Levi's father, Michele Levi being Primo Levi's paternal grandfather, Giuseppe Levi had negotiated deals in property and gold, but the most profitable branch of his Benevagenna operations was banking. Over the years, his family had made so much money that they were criticized locally as being far too ostentatious. Indeed, at a time when there were no pavements to speak of in Benevagenna, Primo Levi's ancestors had laid these very lavish flagstones along the verge outside their home. The locals would tut-tut in Piedmontese dialect, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, troppe per in sacca, which means too many stones in that house, meaning brand new flagstones. So what do we know about this unfortunate Michele Levi, the writer's grandfather? Well, for one thing, he was among the first generation of Piedmontese Jews to relinquish the traditional ghetto trades of moneylending and goldsmithery. It seems he didn't want to go into his father's business, banking, and graduated instead from Turin in civil engineering. No one in Michele Levi's family had lived in the Piedmontese capital before. As I said, little is known of Primo Levi's grandfather. By all accounts, he was frail, prone to melancholy, and not very tall, 1 meter 67 centimeters, according to his army conscription papers. He failed his army medical owing to a hernia, it said, on the right side of his groin. While he was studying in Turin, he met his future wife, Adele Sinigallia, a Turin-born sophisticate and vamp, 5 years younger than he. Eventually, Adele left Turin to live with her husband, Michele, in provincial Benevagenna. But apparently she was not at all happy in her marriage, and by the time of her third pregnancy, in about 1881, she was conducting an affair with the town physician, Dr. Felice Rebaudengo. Now, this man is remembered today as a tall Freemason with a long black beard. Not only was he 5 years younger than Adele, but he was baptized a Catholic. So while the doctor flirted with Adele, the Levis were about to lose their family business, as well as much of their wealth and their position in Piedmontese society. If you ask them today, the elderly inhabitants of Benevagenna speak very fondly of I Levi dei Tulipani, the Levis of the tulips. This very curious epithet refers to a flower-strewn cascina, or farmhouse, outside Benevagenna, that now stands semi-dilapidated by a chalk stream. For miles around, this farmhouse was the only place where wild tulips grew. Tulip bulbs were eminently portable, and ripples of tulip growing in Piedmont indicated where the persecuted Jews had settled since their flight from Spain in the 15th century. At some stage, however, the affectionate nickname, the Levis of the Tulips, was replaced by the Piedmontese expression for a soft touch or a foolish person. You can still hear this, I think, in some parts of Piedmont. They say, "Ti sei un tulipan," you're a ripe tulip, you really are a tulip. The locals would still say this of a naive or innocent person. And no doubt the inhabitants of Benevagenna, the Benese as they're called, gossiped about that foolish old tulip, Giuseppe Levi, and his wife Enrichetta, who were too rich for their own good, it was believed, and who later were devastated later by the scandal that was to involve their son Michele, Primo Levi's paternal grandfather. In the summer of 1888, the Levi bank crashed, and the Levi family house in Piazza Botero was besieged by angry creditors. In terror, Michele Levi fled to Turin nearby with his servants. It's not known if he was accompanied by his parents, Giuseppe and Enrichetta, but under the bleak headline, "Suicide of an Engineer," the Turin newspaper Gazzetta del Popolo reported in its weekend edition of the 26th to 27th of July, 1888, quote, "Last night at 2 a.m., engineer Michele Levi of Benevicenna, aged 40, threw himself out of a window from the second floor, which I think is the third floor in American usage, of a residence at 18 Via San Francesco de Paola into the courtyard below. He was rushed to hospital, but was dead on admission. The physical cause of his death is recorded as precipitazione dall'alto, a fall from a great height. Exactly the same words would appear on Primo Levi's autopsy 99 years later. Today, in Turin's old Jewish cemetery, there's an isolated section for suicides, broken and overgrown with weeds. A headstone marks the grave of Primo Levi's grandfather. The headstone reads: "Alla cara memoria di Levi ingegnere Michele, rapito alla festa dei suoi cari il 26 luglio 1888. La moglie e I figli pregano eterna pace. To the dear memory of engineer Michele Levi, snatched from the affection of his loved ones on the 26th of July, 1888. His wife and sons pray for his eternal peace." After my biography was published in England 2 years ago, I was very often asked whether there was a connection between Primo Levi's death and that of his Piedmontese grandfather, because they seem to be so similar. And my reply still is, we can only speculate. It is possible that in some small closed corner within himself, Levi had not forgotten the suicidal leap of his paternal grandfather, Michele, from a second floor window in Turin in 1888. Research indeed shows that a suicidal tendency can be transmitted down the generation like a sort of dangerous gene. It is possible that Levi was lethally susceptible to his grandfather's example. But in the end, though, and I think out of a sort of respect for Primo Levi, we have to say that we can't really know. And in the end, too, I believe it's probably fruitless to speculate any further. Primo Levi's father, Cesare Levi, who was the son of the unfortunate Michele Levi, was a graduate of Turin's Royal School of Applied Engineering, as was Michele. And unlike his future son Primo, was very much a bon vivant and, by all accounts, a lady killer. Late 1890s Turin, the Turin of Cesare Levi's student days, was among the most flourishing of European cities. In their Frenchified dialect, the inhabitants would say Turin ca bugia, Turin really moves. And in a few years, the city would in fact be the industrial dynamo of Italy. It was to be an innovative, technological city that looked eagerly to the future. In 1900, a small car factory opened on Turin's Corso Dante. It was called Fiat, Fabbrica Italiana Automobili Torino. And as the first motor cars chugged through the city's streets, horses would pan whinny in fear at the sight of these strange contraptions. On those streets and in those cafes, everywhere, there was talk of enterprise, credit, publicity, and this new business of the travelling salesman. By the time Primo Levi's father was studying engineering, Turin was also capital of Italy's cinema industry, a small Hollywood on the banks of the River Po. It was also capital of La Moda Italiana, the Italian fashion industry, and in fact it set the fashion for swirling Art Nouveau or Liberty style patterns and the S-line in dresses, which daringly accentuated body curves. As well as being a hive of film and fashion, Turin in Primo Levi's father's day was also a noted centre of so-called positivist thought. Cesare Levi, the writer's father, was absorbed, he was absolutely obsessed by this philosophy, which held that only positive facts, that is, demonstrable facts as opposed to just merely theoretical ones, constituted true knowledge. In 1876, the self-styled craniometrist Cesare Lombroso had founded in Turin a new discipline of criminal anthropology. Lombroso and his circle called themselves positivists, not because they were certain, though they were certain, but in reference to their objective and apparently very empirical methods. With the aid of calipers and craniometry charts, they tried to define the existence of what they called a delinquent type, according to physical characteristics. So things like handle-shaped ears or prehensile feet and other apish stigmata were all considered these sort of telltale atavisms. sort of criminality. Primo Levi's father knew Lombroso very well and was familiar with all of Lombroso's disciples in Turin. Today, of course, Lombroso is rightly discredited. The Museum of Criminal Anthropology in Turin, I don't know if any of you have been there to this or had the misfortune to see this place, is full of boxed precision instruments and these old photographs of handcuffed so-called delinquents. Lombroso's head itself is gruesomely preserved in a bottle of formaldehyde. One student there told me that its cranial bumps betray a very strong criminal tendency. But the misguidedness of Lombroso's theory that born criminals should be known by their anatomy in no way, I think, diminishes the value of the positivist method. And this was very, very exacting and always recognised the sort of sensory limits of knowledge. Never believe anything until it's proved true. Cesare Levi, Primo Levi's father, in spite of his spiritualist dabblings, he was very interested in spiritualism, understood all these qualities. And I think he passed them on to his son, Primo, whose mature writing is suffused, I would say, with this positivist spirit of his birthplace, Turin, the capital of Piedmont. Indeed, there's one influence that runs through his book, Se questo è un uomo, if this is a man, like the sort of black line in a lobster, and that is Charles Darwin, who was an absolute hero to the Turin positivists. The British Victorian evolutionist, Darwin, had very precisely defined the sensory realm, sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, beyond which it was absolutely immoral for the investigator to stray. Accordingly, in true positivist spirit, Levi's account of Auschwitz, Se questo è un uomo, is strictly an eyewitness report. It contains absolutely nothing that Levi had not seen or heard himself. But perhaps I've digressed a little here about Lombroso and cranial bumps. Primo Levi was a child, as a child, he was very much in awe of his maternal grandfather, Cesare Luzzati, who was born in Casale, the Piedmontese town, not far from Turin, in about 1869. This character interests me a lot during my research. In his black Homburg hat, Cesare Luzzati, this grandpa, was a man of immense style and presence. His main interest, appropriately enough, was Piedmontese food. Yet he paid dearly for his sweet tooth because diabetes actually eventually killed him. A weighing machine stood by his bed, but away from his wife, who was a very controlling creature, he binged lavishly on cakes and pastries. He was not a very tall man, Cesare Luzzati. He weighed about 102 kilograms and was only just about able to squeeze behind the wheel of his motor car. Aside from his enormous bulk, what distinguished this man, Grandpa Luzzati, Primo Levi's maternal grandfather, was his wonderfully stubborn character. He was a man who knew his own mind absolutely and stood by it immovably. In Piedmontese, he was what I think is still called today a bougenin, one who never moved. Primo Levi would acquire something, I think, of his grandfather's inflexible streak. Rather wonderfully, Grandfather Luzzati would say in Piedmontese dialect, "It's much better to be a mule than a weathercock." If Primo Levi grew up in Turin amid affluence and comfort, it was partly due to this man Cesare Luzzati. Cesare Luzzati ran a textile store which was reckoned to be the best in Turin and sold all sorts of decorative knickknacks and things, as well as tartan for every Scottish clan. The weekly visit to the textile store was an important part of Primo Levi's early life in Piedmont. The store was situated at 37 Via Roma, near today's station in Turin, in a row of wedding dress showrooms and various pasticceria, pastry shops. To enter Grandfather's shop was to stray into a very mysterious dark cave. At one end was a single opaque window for customers to inspect their fabrics. Levi loved to watch the staff, Primo Levi, he loved to watch the staff bustle among their ledgers and pencils. One of them, a man named Giandone, Big Acorn, wore this apparently hideous, ill-fitting red wig that Primo found particularly sinister. He was also fascinated by somebody called Signorina Savina, a cashier who had a spectacularly large bosom. according to Primo Levi anyway. As a special treat, Grandpa Luzzati would take Primo and his sister Anna Maria to the cafe bar next door to buy them sugar sticks or coloured marzipan confections. Anything, of course, which his grandchildren didn't want to eat, this diabetic character would quickly and guiltily consume on his own. A very inventive man, Grandpa Luzzati, had coined some very bizarre Piedmontese sayings for use in his Via Roma store. A shop assistant called Emilio, in rented accommodation upstairs above the shop, apparently refused to hear whenever Luzzati called for him. So Emilio's upstairs became the Luzzati speak for anyone at all who was remotely hard of hearing. Sta sopra Emilio, he would say of an unsuspecting client. Another coinage, the very, very strange 13-1 in Piedmontese, ter desu, meant a nuisance customer. This was applied to the non-Jewish client who would come into the store on the 13th of January, 13-1, having spent all his or her money at Christmas. And typically this client would pull down absolutely every bolt of fabric in the shop, only to leave the store without buying anything at all. So this was a ter desum, a 13-1. The Luzzati fabric store was one of the few places in Turin, very interestingly I think, where Judeo-Piedmontese dialect could still be heard. This particular dialect was used by staff whenever they didn't want to be understood by Catholic clients. So a tiresome ter desum, or 13-1, might be sold a bolt of stoffa hazirut, rubbishy fabric, for example. Just occasionally, though, these discourtesies were mistakenly used in the presence of a Jewish customer, and then Grandpa Luzzati was obviously highly embarrassed. But I want to jump ahead now to Primo Levi the writer. Published in Italy in 1978, Primo Levi's most obviously Piedmontese book, and also his most affectionate tribute to his Piedmontese roots, is his novel The Monkey's Wrench. It's a series, this novel, of semi-fictional short stories about a very bumptious Piedmontese construction worker, Tino Falsone, and his adventures around the world on oil rigs and ships and suspension bridges. The book's Italian title, La Chiave Stella, the star-shaped key, is named after the polygon-shaped socket wrench resembling a spanner which Falsone carries close to his hip. In search of material for this book, throughout 1976 and 1977, Levi trawled car repair shops and tinkers' yards in Borgo San Paolo and other Turin outskirts, where mechanics still spoke a semi-industrialized dialect spiked with all sorts of technical jargon. One of these specialist locutions was dai, which means knock it into trim. And another was date una regola alle valvole, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, which means adjust your valves. These expressions reveal the Piedmontese mechanics' concern for perfection and precision, and they are Falsone speak, but they also represent, I think, Primo Levi's own private guidelines for literary concision. Tino Falsone, the Piedmontese construction worker, made his debut in Levi's short story With Malice Afterthought, it's called, Meditato con Malizia, which is published in La Stampa, the Turin newspaper, on the 13th of March 1977. The story opens as Falsone is tucking into a plate of roast beef in a workers' canteen somewhere in the lower Volga in Russia. It's just one of two Piedmontese on contract to a factory there. The other, the unnamed or narrator, is a Turin chemist and concentration camp survivor who remains silent throughout Falsone's drawn-out tale of rigging and construction. With a few deft strokes, Primo Levi had very skillfully denominated the character of his new Piedmontese fictional hero. In his mid-30s, tall, lean, prematurely bald, Tino Falsone is a very gruff character with a bachelor's roving eye. In fact, his Christian name, Tino or Libertino, is a diminutive of libertine. He speaks a very colourful Piedmontese and has travelled the world as an oil rig and pylon constructor. Though he's not apparently very well educated, so he says, he has a very smart, if didactic intelligence, and is lovable and thoroughly irritating in equal measure. The essence of this novel, La Chiave Stella, Interspersed between Faustone's blue-collar tales of construction is Levi's elegant and often witty vindication of il rusco, everyday work. Right from the start, Levi was determined to write a life-enhancing book that dignified Faustone's construction trade and put it on the literary map, in much the same way that Levi's earlier work, Il Sistema Periodico, the periodic table, had done for chemistry. Indeed, the book draws very heavily on Levi's childhood understanding of the work ethic. Pride in a job well done, il lavoro ben fatto, was an intrinsic part of what it meant to be Piedmontese, and perhaps also especially Turinese. In many ways, La Chiave Stella, The Monkey's Wrench, was to be one of the most personal books that Levi wrote. It was the one that revealed his most deeply held cultural beliefs. The picaresque trials, the adventurous trials of Tino Faustone were in fact rooted in Primo Levi's fascist school days. During fascism, the virtue of hard work and toil was eulogized everywhere in Turin on billboards, and Mussolini never ceased to praise bricklayers and stonecutters, why not, who work with their hands. Primo's first school reading primer, Le mie perle, my pearls, warned, I quote, that the lazy person is harmful to society, and that mental instability, if not death, would result from laziness. Woe betide loafers, says the book. Another of Primo Levi's boyhood primers, called Il libro dell'operaio, put forward a very similar sort of ideal about how there's a virtue in hard work. But both of these primers have been published in Turin. And as I said at the beginning of this talk, from a very early age, Levi had the greatest respect for people who took pride in their work. And it can be perhaps no accident that the foulest, most unforgivable insult in Piedmontese is, I believe, strassum, which means a good for nothing. In later years, Levi would say that Tino Faustone was one of his finest literary creations, and in Piedmont, La Chiave Stella is still held in great affection. On its publication in Italy in 1978, the book was rightly seen as a contribution to the long tradition of Italian regional and dialect literature, and was favourably compared to Pier Paolo Pasolini's two dialect-rich Roman novels of the 1950s, Ragazzi di Vita and Una Vita Violenta, which Levi, somewhat surprisingly perhaps, admired. Surprisingly, because Pasolini's world was very different to Primo Levi's, I think, with these sort of violent street kids. La Chiave Stella, in many ways, I think represents a sort of exorcism of the cynical motto over the gates of Auschwitz: work makes you free. Arbeit macht frei. Levi had begun his literary career with a portrait of man the destroyer, Se questo è un uomo, but he continued it with a vision of man the maker, Homo faber, represented in the Piedmontese person of Tino Faustone. Interestingly, La Chiave Stella was Levi's first literary work, apart from Se questo è un uomo perhaps, to reach a large and I would say kind of non-bookish audience. At a book signing near Turin, Primo Levi told me, this was in 1978, a young man introduced himself to Levi in heavy Piedmontese. Permesso, may I? I am Faustone, he told Primo Levi. And guess what job I do? Levi replied, you must be a construction rigger. And he was. The author, in some ways, had found his character. Nothing pleased Primo Levi more than when his books managed to reach out to the broad public. And when he heard that 46 steel riggers at the Peirani construction company in Piedmont had read his book, La Chiave Stella, he immediately and very excitedly asked the Turin firm to supply him with company brochures on which to base illustrations for a school edition of the book. The company chairman, Riccardo Peirani, told me Levi didn't want school children to form the wrong impression of what derricks and crane towers look like. I'd like to conclude this celebration of Primo Levi's relationship to Piedmont with a brief homage to the Piedmontese bricklayer Lorenzo in Se questo è un uomo. Some of you may remember this unforgettable character. In June 1944, at Auschwitz, Levi was seconded to a bricklaying commando, and one of the chief masons in this commando, Lorenzo Perrone, turned out to have been born in Fossano, near Levi's ancestral Benevagenna. The moment he heard it, Lorenzo Peroni's thick Piedmontese accent filled Levi with a surge of compatriotic solidarity. As Levi stood on the Auschwitz worksite in his striped prison clothes, degraded and skeletal, he learned that Peroni had worked for the Beyotti and Company construction firm, which is one of about 40 companies, foreign and German, that were employed to build Auschwitz III, which is the synthetic rubber and oil division of the death camp. Officially, Lorenzo Peroni was a volunteer worker in the Third Reich, and as such, he could receive food parcels from Italy, he could sleep in comfortable Italian billets, and was fed adequately on a German Guards ration. But like many Italian civilians at Auschwitz, Piedmontese or otherwise, Lorenzo Peroni brusquely refused cigarettes and other luxuries from Germans, whose discipline and cruelty he loathed. Middle-aged, faintly stooped, with greying hair, Lorenzo was apparently a born desponder, his brother Secondo told me, and a somewhat peevish personality. Indeed, if a German foreman so much as criticised his masonry on the Auschwitz worksite, he would leave in a huff, in a great temper. Peroni had seen things at Auschwitz, obviously, that offended his dignity, and the poverty of his birthplace in Piedmont, where the poor ate bread soaked in wine, was terrible. But in the violent, degraded environment of Auschwitz, there was real starvation. Each day for 6 months, this Piedmontese bricklayer, this mason, smuggled Levi an extra soup ration. No words were said as he left the mess tin by the half-constructed brick wall. The soup might contain a sparrow's wing or prune stones or salami rind, even bits of La Stampa newspaper reduced to pulp. Yet these scrag ends provided Levi with an extra 500 calories, without which he certainly would not have survived. Levi repeatedly warned this Lorenzo Peroni, the providential mason, of the crime he was committing in helping a Jew, but Peroni just shrugged his shoulders. He helped Levi as a moral duty, and for as long as Levi was his bricklaying assistant, the food continued to arrive safely. Peroni helped Levi in one other vital way. Virtually no Jew at Auschwitz was able to smuggle letters out, let alone receive post in return. As one can well imagine, letters meant more to prisoners than anything else. They gave a slender meaning to their lives and a sense of connection to the world they had lost. Thanks to Peroni, however, Levi was able to send letters out of the camp and even to receive them from his family. After the war, Lorenzo effectively drank himself to death. Back in his native Fossano in Piedmont, reduced to poverty, he would sell scrap metal in the snow without an overcoat, his face apparently blue from the cold. Inevitably, Peroni's alcoholism made him susceptible to tuberculosis, and he began to cough up blood. In early 1952, Levi managed to find Peroni a bed in Savigliano Hospital, not far from Fossano in the Piedmontese countryside, where he apparently knew a doctor. In this hospital, he would bring the Piedmontese mason wool jumpers, a new pair of winter trousers, and he would sit by his bed, apparently holding his hand. However, Peroni began to hallucinate rats and lions, and according to his brother Secondo, winged beasts. Briefly, hospital had looked like his salvation, but Peroni kept running away in search of alcohol. After 6 months, in and out of the ward, they found him moribund in a ditch. His liver had shut down. Lorenzo Peroni died in Savigliano Hospital in the early hours of 30th April 1952. Incredibly, Lorenzo Peroni had helped other prisoners at Auschwitz, typically without telling anybody. His charity made no distinctions, and it was incontestably, I think, a holy act. In fact, it was the charity of Piedmont's now long-lost Cultura contadina, that sort of peasant culture that had always looked after its own. In Lorenzo's day, or so the parish priest of Fossano, Don Carlo Lenta, told me, the bricklayers and the fishermen of this town would go out of their way to help the weakest in the community. Though Lorenzo said he could no longer believe in God after Auschwitz, he retained, I think, a sense of religion, a compassion for the weak and the downtrodden. Towards the end of his life, Primo Levi was depressed himself and weighed down by domestic problems. He was working on his last literary project, which was a collection of imaginary letters from a scientist to a wealthy Piedmontese patron. These letters apparently explained various cooking and chemical phenomena. But the writing was blocked. Levi was troubled, I think, by other matters. Almost the last newspaper article he wrote, The Black Hole of Auschwitz, bitterly indicted, it was a bitter criticism of the new generation of German historians who contended that the Nazi genocide was not a unique instance of human infamy at all, but just one link in a chain reaction which started with the Soviet gulags under Stalin and went on to Vietnam and Pol Pot's Cambodia in the 1970s. Levi was clearly horrified by this move to diminish what he saw as man's defining atrocity, and elsewhere he spoke of the lido connato, or the loathsome effort, of revisionist historians. Now, for a man who rarely raised his voice, I think that these are very, very strong words for Primo Levi. If Auschwitz was the catalyst that turned Levi, this great Piedmontese figure, into a writer, I think we have to say that the depression that enveloped him in the final months was compounded by various things. Whether it was mainly caused by his terrible past can only be speculation. The point is that the books remain, and those show what a literary genius was lost to the world. Like Dante before him, Levi had brought back gold out of hell. A couple of years before he died, Levi had said that he wanted as his epitaph on his tombstone the Greek words which Homer had used of his voyager Ulysses, polyplankte. These words, polyplankte, mean much erring or driven to wander far and wide. In his homesick exile, separated by friends and home, the long-enduring Ulysses was a kind of everyman. And so was Primo Levi, this great Italian. And I think this is why he still feels so close to us today in the early 21st century. Thank you.
When you met Levi, you did eventually turn to the topic of Auschwitz.
Yeah.
And what did he have to say about it?
He related the story to me of Lorenzo Peroni, in fact. It was still something he wanted to tell anybody that was remotely interested in this character. What he told me about Auschwitz is what he really wrote in his book. I mean, he, as I said earlier, was very skillful interviewee and didn't really say anything, as I subsequently found out, especially new about the camp. But at the time, it was all new to me, I must say. I don't think anything specific at the moment. Yes.
I didn't know that he was interested in food, in eating well, which is always something that shows interest in life, survival.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So, am I right in remembering that he talks also about food in his book, and becomes almost like a metaphor of life?
Yes, I think you're probably referring to a dream he describes, where he's sitting at the table with his family in Turin, and he's hallucinating this incredible menu.
Exactly.
And his sister's there, and his mother's there. Not his father, who had died by then. But yes, I agree with you. Levi's interest in food doesn't suggest this man who was who was a depressive character all his life. But I think a lot of Italians are interested in food, aren't they? Right, Piedmontese food is a type of cuisine I think very special to itself. I mean, Levi was an expert, and he knew a lot about this food. In fact, his last book, which I mentioned, was to be a series of letters, imaginary letters, written between a chemist and a Piedmontese noblewoman, describing various phenomena to do with cooking, like white mayonnaise, gels, and various, how to make vinegar, which he saw as chemical reactions. So cooking for Primo Levi is a form of chemistry.
People who are survivors Holocaust feel this tremendous sense of guilt as having
Yes.
been. And he survived by sheer luck, I mean, because
Yeah.
so many things happened to him. I'll let him be in the right place at the wrong place at the right time. Did he ever allude to the fact that how he felt guilty or lucky to have been in certain places at certain times?
Yes, I think it would be ridiculous to assume that Levi didn't feel any sense of guilt for surviving. He does somewhere talk about this. I mentioned it in my book. He confided to a writer that he did feel a certain guilt for not only surviving the camp, but also indirectly working towards the German war effort. Because as a chemist, he was put into a laboratory which saved his life, because he was out of the cold towards the last months of the camp, and he worked in this laboratory as a chemist in aid of the German war effort. So I think obscurely he felt his sense of guilt, but whether or not it was just this one thing that caused him to take his life in the end, we can't really say. But yes, he did feel it.
At the time that you wrote your biography,
Yeah, I know what you're going to ask.
what is her name?
I can't.
Caroline.
Something like that, yeah.
The
Carol Andrew. Oh, yeah, there was another as well before both of us called Miriam Anison.
no, I mean the American biographer. Yes, Caroline.
Yeah, but she's not American actually. She's Canadian and lives in
Or
England.
Canadian, okay.
Whatever.
And apparently you wrote this biography almost at the same time. You started, and then she started right after, right? Or
Yeah,
something like that.
yes, that's right.
And you were both asked by publishers to do that.
Yeah.
Did this publisher knew that you were going to write a book? I mean, is
No.
it? No, they didn't know.
No.
And did you know about each other?
Not at the beginning. I mean, I don't want to sound pro or anything, but I had done a year's research into this book before my arrival arrived in Turin. So by the time my arrival arrived in Turin, I'd interviewed most of Levi's relatives and friends. In fact, there was one occasion when one of our interviewees rather maliciously double booked us in at the same time. So I arrived at this man's house in Turin, and as I rang the bell, Carol Angier emerged from another, I think from the lavatory. And I extended my hand and said, "Are you the famous Carol Angier?" And he said, "Yes, are you the famous Ian Thomson?" So this was like a scene from a very bad Woody Allen film. Or a Henry James short story. They were going to be more elevated. But I have to say that the writing a biography, knowing that arrival is on your back, is absolute hell. Because you know that whatever you write will eventually be compared and contrasted with the others. So in fact our books were reviewed at the same time in all the British papers. Yeah, it was absolutely appalling. I'd get up in the morning and go to the newsagents shaking and buy about 10 newspapers. And I think in the end, although it sounds incredible, having a rival on your back can also be an advantage, because I certainly think that Carol had spurred me to, had sort of obliged me to interview more people and dig out more material than I would have done had I not been in this competition. But it was an absolutely crazy situation, and never again. However, I was commissioned a long time ago to write a biography of a very obscure English doctor and poet from the 19th century called Thomas Lovell Bedders, and nobody's ever heard of him. And to my amazement, I found that there was another person writing a biography of Thomas Lovell Bedders. So I've ditched that project.
And what is your comment on the conjecture of this Carol something,
Carol Angier.
where she tried to explain certain aspects in the life of Primo Levi in terms of his repressed sexuality?
I haven't read the book. I don't think I ever will. But that's a sort of psychobabble which I don't really, I flinch away from it instinctively, but I'm sure it has its place, you know, in certain circle. Thank you. But it's just not my style. And I think you can go too far down that path, really. There's speculation and there's historical kind of accuracy with the facts. Of course, I was the first camp. Yeah.
You made a parallel between the death of Michele, the grandfather, who you said threw himself from out from the second floor.
Yes, the balcony.
Well, I was thinking of the contrast. Primo Levi died by falling inside the house instead.
Yes.
And that's an interesting parallel and contrast also. Almost, the house becomes almost the home.
Yes, perhaps it was part of his reserve that he didn't want to make a public spectacle of his death in Corso Re Umberto, which is much more of a sort of public thoroughfare than Via San Francesco de Paolo, where his grandfather committed suicide. But what you can say about both these deaths is that throwing yourself from that height would allow no room for survival. I mean, death would have been certain and instantaneous. And it would have not allowed for any kind of last-minute hesitation. As you can imagine, you might, if you were sitting down at a desk with some poisons or something, shouldn't I? Once you've tipped yourself over, that's it. But I agree, there is an interesting distinction there, which I didn't investigate in my book.
Again, I didn't hear it only from you, but from other people who spoke about Primo Levi, that it was rather strange, his family situation, in the sense that he was married in that apartment where he was born, that there was his mother, and also I think at a certain point the mother-in-law, right? And the sister, so that he was very involved with his family.
Sure.
Does it really seem very strange? I mean, in that particular culture, Cultura, I come from Padua, and from that point of view, Padua is not so different from Turin. You are supposed to live with the family where you are born. You are supposed to be with your relatives, or I don't know how many of our friends are still in the apartment where they were born. It doesn't seem such a strange situation that might have led Primo Levi to being constricted like in a prison. That is mainly what the other biographer says, that it was. I didn't read the book, but at least
well done. I don't know. I mean, to me, I wanted to get away from my parents as quickly as possible. So I was out of the house at the age of 16. I think in Levi's case, it did seem to take on an unhealthy sense of enclosure. He, from a very early age, was abnormally, I think, close to his mother, because, as I described in my biography, either Primo, the child, or his sister, had caught his father, this philandering Cesare, in flagrante with a woman, with his secretary. And this is a deeply shocking thing to Primo. And I think he wanted to give his mother, although this is speculation, the sort of love and attention that he felt his father had never given her. So in this flat that, towards the end of his life also, as you say, had, not all the time, but some of the time, his mother-in-law, who was blind, immobile. It can't have been, well, certainly wasn't a very happy environment, but I think you're right, it probably isn't so unusual. I know that after the Second World War, when there was such a shortage of houses and accommodation, Primo Levi moved into the family flat because that's all that there was. And I think the deal was that he was going to move out with his wife as soon as they found a flat. But he was so attached to his mother that in fact he never did. And this mother was probably much resented, I would imagine, by his wife, who felt that she was sort of second best woman in the house. So from the very beginning, I think there was something difficult going on there, as well as being classically Italian. Sorry.
I've been told that his work is read by Italian school children.
Yes.
And in much the same way that perhaps we read The Diary of Anne Frank.
Yeah.
And it helped us understand the history of the war. And I'm just curious to know a little bit more about how that's true in Italy, and then what was his reaction? Did he become a hero because of his writing? When did he actually write that book?
Say questo more?
Mm-hmm.
Immediately after he came back from
Immediately,
Ireland.
yeah.
So he was published in...
So there was a long period of time that he was known.
When the book first came out after the war, it was virtually ignored. It was only reprinted again in the early 1950s by a much bigger publishing house, the Einaudi, which is a sort of equivalent in Italy of Penguin. And from that moment on, Levi's fame increased, but he always loved the very fact that he was published for school children, that his books became texts that were studied for exams and things. For him was the most he could ever ask for, because his message was getting across to the younger generation. And I think he felt that he was making witnesses of younger people in turn, because the younger people would tell their own children, and the whole the whole act of witness would be passed on second-hand from generation to generation. So, yes, Levi was delighted that his books were published in schools.
All the people you could write about, what drew you to spend so much time on Primo Levi?
That's a good question. Actually, I wouldn't have chosen to write about Primo Levi. I wouldn't have chosen myself to write about Primo Levi. I was commissioned to write the biography. Originally, I was commissioned by Yale University Press in 1988, a year after Levi died, and I said no, because it seemed too recent, and I thought people weren't going to talk to me. But the suicide seemed too recent. And then later on, about 3 years later, another publishing house, Random House UK, asked me, and then they made an offer I couldn't refuse. And I took it on. I'm sorry it sounds so unromantic and unknown, but that's the way it was. It was a sort of practical thing. Yeah.
What technique do you use in writing? It seems that you have tremendous amount of notes.
Yes.
You computerize it.
Did I write it on a computer?
Yeah, and you
Yes.
cross-check with special softwares and so on.
No, I didn't do any of that. I'm not very technologically minded. All I can tell you is that the book was far too big. At the 11th hour, I had a monster on my hands. And because the competition was so intense to get the book out at the same time as my arrival, because otherwise I would sort of lag fatally behind, and my book wouldn't be reviewed in British papers. I cut out 1,200 words, sorry, 120,000 words from the typescript. And I'm very glad I did, because I think it's made for, well, it's certainly lighter, it's easier on one's wrists. But also it's just more concise, it's got more of a pace running through it. But I had card indexes, I had old shoe boxes, I had, index files, cards. It was pretty old-fashioned, my method of trying to get a grip on all this material. I didn't use computers except to write the book. As I say, it went out of control. I think that's the danger of computers anyway. You don't really realize how much you're writing and how much rubbish you're writing.
Yes, in your studies and research, did the Germans treat the Italian prisoners different than others? I've had a sense of that in the past.
Yeah.
Did you sense any of that?
Well, I think that if you mean Italian Jews, or
Italian Jews?
yeah. In the case of Italian Jews, I think it was much tougher, the arrival at Auschwitz for the Italian Jews, because they had not been through the ghetto before, unlike the Polish Jews. So they didn't have this sort of, if you like, training in hardship, in the ordeals. So when they arrived at the camps, the Italians were considered very much, not only by the Germans, but also by fellow Eastern European Jews, as being sort of fragile, vulnerable creatures who were not just going to survive at all, and who were despised, I think, as assimilated, non-religious Jews, whereas often the Polish Jews could somehow look upon Auschwitz as being a sort of momentary eclipse of God's vision, really, and a sort of way of even putting his people on trial. The Italians often didn't have this religious succor, something to hold on to. So they were immediately at a disadvantage, and they were immediately gave the impression of people who were kind of fair game for mockery. So I think that they had a very dreadful time. And in fact, at Primo Levi's convoy of 650 people that departed from Fossili, very, very few survived the first week of arrival. It was the hardest. But as far as civilian workers, non-Jewish workers were concerned, people like Lorenzo Peroni, I think they would have been regarded as traitors because they had previously supported under fascism the German war cause, and suddenly there were these people who turned against Mussolini and Hitler and the Republic of Salo, so they were probably regarded as traitors, so more likely to be maltreated.
So thank you, Ian, again. Very, very great encounter with Primo Levi again.
Thank you.